Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of the Mary Trump Show with my guest, David Rothkopf, host of Deep State Radio podcast, columnist for the Daily Beast, and author of the very soon to be released book, The Must Read American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. And very luckily for me, my friend, David, hi, how are you?
I'm good, Mary. How are you?
Um, a little stressed. Can't imagine why.
No,
What do we
no.
have? 12 days left until the midterms? No,
Yeah, passing very rapidly.
passing very rapidly. Yeah, the last time I checked, it seemed like it was 3 months, and now we're 12 days, soon to be single digits. But yeah, we're going to talk about all of that. But I think your really extraordinary new book, American Resistance, um, helps lay out the case, not just for why the midterms are so important, but why protecting our institutions, which in order to do that requires protecting our democracy, are so important. Um, I have read very, very few books about the Trump administration because it kind of just triggers my PTSD. And from what I've and since I haven't read them, I can't critique them necessarily, but you know, very few of them have seemed to be more than just sort of retellings. And we live through it, and I don't necessarily know what the utility of that is for people who are kind of plugged in anyway. So what makes your book stand out? Besides, not of course to be expected. It's incredibly well written and researched. Um, we'll talk about some of the incredible interviews you had with insiders of the administration, but it connects uh, the chaos and the criminality in some cases and corruption of the Trump administration uh, to the men and women who sacrificed a lot, risked a lot to hold the line because they believed in American institutions. They believed in service. And in that context, it was actually very hopeful. So thank you for that.
Thank them for that.
Well, but thank you for putting it in one place. I don't. Uh, it gives the reader access in a way we wouldn't have had otherwise, right? Because what has seemed to be the case often is that it's just arbitrarily one person here and there, when the reality, as you painted, is that it's the system holding. Um, of course, you also make it clear that the system won't hold indefinitely if it continues to be attacked. But first, I just was wondering what gave you the idea for the book. I mean, obviously, the deep state is something that is been of interest to you for a long time now. You understand how these things work. You were in the Clinton administration. Um, but was it anything in particular that made this book seem necessary to you? Because you just wrote another book like 5 minutes ago.
Well, I do try to write a book every couple of years, but several of the books that I've written have been about how Washington works, with the nature of power, but also the nature of process, the nature of people within the U.S. government. I've written a number of histories, for example, of the NSC and how the foreign policy establishment works. So I'm fascinated by that for a few reasons. One, I've been in it or around it most of my life. Two, there are a lot of stories that don't get told. You talk about these Trump books, and I think there were, the last count, there were like 1,200 of these books about former President Trump. Um, well, the U.S. government is the largest organization in the world. He's only one piece of that.
Hmm.
was interesting to me how it would function. The other thing I noticed was that the uh, the guardrails around President Trump were faulty in many respects. We had the Congress. While they did impeach him twice, the Senate and Republicans in the Senate were able to block conviction. So it didn't work because he committed crimes. He should have been convicted from the crimes. He should have been removed from office. Certainly after January 6th, the Republicans should have had the courage to say this guy needs to be convicted, if only because it will keep him from running for office again. And they didn't do it. The Department of Justice, which should have been pursuing the application of the law in a fair and unbiased way, stopped doing that, started behaving more like his own lawyer, whether it was Jeff Sessions or Bill Barr or people in between. And so that guardrail broke. But there was one guardrail that on a regular basis, and I think far more often than anybody knows, actually held. And that guardrail was people in the United States government who were sworn to uphold the Constitution, who put it ahead of Trump, who put it ahead of the president and said, no, we're not going to implement your crazy idea. We're not going to implement your dangerous idea. We're not simply going to do what you ask because we have an obligation to uphold the law. We don't report to the president. We report to the American people. And I found that story inspiring, chilling at times, because a lot of the things that the former president wanted to do were so out of the norm, so dangerous. We don't even talk about many of them. But there were these people, some career civil servants, some career foreign service, some career intelligence, some career in military, and some, by the way, in the Trump cabinet and sub cabinet, who were just people who often served in government, had come back in for another Republican administration, who said, we can't let this go off the rails. And because of them, it didn't. Not in every way that it could have. There's certainly plenty bad that happened, but I thought it was important to tell their story. And final point is, because I've lived and worked in Washington for 35 years, and I've listened to what I consider to be Ronald Reagan's big lie, not Donald Trump's big lie, which is government is bad. People in government, and the government itself is something we should have less of. And that's a very dangerous big lie, because not only does it denigrate people who do something of value, it discourages people who are of quality to enter the government. It enables people to say, hey, the government is lying, as Donald Trump did, because you say, well, we don't trust the government and they must be lying. And it also enables not secondarily, but it also enables people to pare away parts of the government that regulate and enforce the law, which, by the way, is why Republican benefactors support this lie, because it lets them keep more of their money. It lets them get richer and richer. And so, the best way to debunk the lie is to show the quality of the people, to show the fact that in the nearly 4 decades I've been in Washington, 95% of the people who work there are actually good people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents. They're actually public servants trying to serve the public. And I thought it was important to see that story.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that became so clear, is that the difference between political operators and civil servants, and how political operators come and go, but the civil servants are the bedrock of our institutions. And most people don't think about that. They as you said, thanks in large part to Ronald Reagan saying, government isn't the solution, it's the problem. People paint all government officials with the same broad brushstrokes, and nothing could be farther from the truth. And one of the things that was both heartening and worrisome was the extent to which these individuals and sometimes, banding together in groups, were willing to put themselves on the line. And I'm thinking in particular, I mean, there were many people, but I'm thinking in particular in this instance of Kirsten Nielsen, who was at the Department of Homeland Security. From an outsider's perspective, she was just awful. Like, she was just part of the problem, and that's not the case. She was, to the best of her ability, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that she behaved perfectly or didn't buy into certain things that were troubling. But generally speaking, within the system as it's designed, she did the best she could to slow down or mitigate much of the damage that Donald and his closest advisors wanted to do, specifically in the context of the border and the child separation policy. And I'm assuming, knowing that their reputations at the time were taking a potentially fatal hit. So my question about situations like that is, first of all, it seemed like the most effective way to prevent Donald from doing as much damage as possible was to slow the process down. So, which worked in a lot of instances, because he's so impulsive, he couldn't keep a thought in his head for more than 30 seconds. So if they could slow things down for a few days or weeks or months, then he would forget about it or come up with a solution that tricked him into thinking he was getting what he wanted to get. But it seems though that in future we need our institutions to be more nimble, because what worries me is that, yes, they held to one degree or another. Would they have held for 4 more years of this?
Well, that's really a critical question. I mean, really a critical question, because, when Donald Trump arrived in the presidency, he didn't have the slightest clue how the United States government worked. He thought he could work it just like he had worked his little business. Most people still don't really understand that the company he ran was a small company, a family company. It didn't run like a big corporation. It ran like your neighborhood stationery store. There were a couple of people. They owned it. They made the decisions, and it was all about him. And he sort of thought he could come into the U.S. government. He didn't need a cabinet. He didn't need advisors. The ones he hired, he was sort of hiring the way you might buy a pair of, designer jeans or, some outfit, because he was wearing them as, to sort of say, hey, look, I'm the president. Look at these generals. I'm the president. But he wasn't hiring them for their advice. He didn't want their advice, really. He certainly didn't think he needed it. And so at the beginning of the administration, a lot of the things he did, bad things that he did, could be stopped by people who said, no, Mr. President, that's against the law. No, Mr. President, we have to do what the Congress says. No, Mr. President, that's unconstitutional. And that worked. But what happened over the 4 years was that Trump started to realize that this guardrail was there, that there were people who are not loyal to him. And he started to say, well, there's a way to get around that. I don't want to have to confirm a cabinet secretary. I'll just appoint an acting cabinet secretary. I don't want to have to put in somebody that, the Washington professionals want. I'm going to put somebody in who's loyal to me. I'm going to make Rick Grinnell the acting director of national intelligence. I'm going to take Kash Patel and I'm going to plug him in the intelligence community. Or I'm going to plug him in over at the Department of Defense. I'm going to take Chad Wolf and I'm going to make him the director of Homeland Security. And then, all those people who do what I want. So by the end, Trump realized that these people were an impediment, and he had begun to find his workaround. And many of the people I spoke to who served in his cabinet, who served in his sub cabinet, who were the highest level career professionals, said they were terrified that if he got elected again, he'd use that knowledge to start to eliminate all these people who were the effective guardrail. And in fact, he had a proposal, which was called Schedule F, which he began to implement at the end of his administration. Biden reversed, which essentially made it easier to fire civil servants and career employees. Well, and some people, by the way, estimate that the total number that could be fired under this is like 50,000 people. Well, that's, we think, well, the Trump era is behind us. Well, first of all, he's running again, but secondly, or he may be, but secondly, Newt Gingrich, other senior people in the Republican Party have now come on and said, no, we want to do this. Well, getting rid of or imposing Schedule F and being able to get rid of these people is not cutting away at the bureaucracy. It's opening the door to authoritarianism. It's saying we don't need people to place the Constitution first. Personalities who lead the government and their parties are what matter to us. And that sets us off on a slippery slope that will get laws broken, civil rights violated, fundamental rights eliminated, elections no longer to be free and fair, and so forth. And so that's why it's important to understand the role they played, or we're simply going to end it if these guys get what they want.
Yeah, and one thing Donald did for us, probably without meaning to, is shine a very bright light on weaknesses in the system that can be exploited and that in many instances were exploited. And what you do with the book is you essentially highlight some of the most salient and dangerous moments or periods in his administration, starting with the transition, going through the early days of the Muslim ban and child separation policy, COVID, of course, foreign policy, which was absolutely terrifying, and then ending, of course, with the big lie and January 6th. So do you think enough has been learned and enough has been done to take advantage of the fact that we've learned so much about where the systems need to be shored up, or not?
Definitely not.
Right.
First of all, you could go write a book about this. 100 people could go write a book about it. I am confident that each and every one of them will come up with 100 more absolutely shocking abuses of the presidency. The people around the president remain loyal to him to this day.
Yeah.
And we continue to be shocked. Look at the theft of national security documents, and so forth. And so there's a lot more to it. But these people in the government doing the best that they could, and by the way, some of them, should Kirstjen Nielsen have fought harder against the child separation policy? Yes. Should Bill Barr have not been a complete enemy of democracy for most of his term of office? Even though at the very end he said, "No, you're going too far." Yeah, of course he should have, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not in the business of reputation cleansing. I'm just trying to report what happened,
Mhm.
and it's not as simple as four legs good, two legs bad to
Right.
refer to Orwell. It's that, but having said that there's more to it than these people doing this. If somebody breaks the law's got to be enforced.
Yeah.
And so far that hasn't happened. So far, Donald Trump and the people closest to Donald Trump, with very few exceptions, committed serial obstruction of justice, committed serial violations of laws regarding our national security, whether it's the theft of documents or the other things that they did that gave advantage to our enemies. were involved in a coup attempt, and that they haven't been indicted, they haven't been tried, and they haven't been convicted. And until it's clear that there are real consequences for those actions, we are definitely not out of the woods, particularly since this is not about Donald Trump. This is
Right.
about a movement, a right wing extremist, often white supremacist, often theocratic, even movement in the United States. And if he is not elected, but Ron DeSantis is, or Kristi Noem is, or someday Carrie Lake is, or you pick the people in the movement, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, you're going to end up with more of this, where the ideology of the party is the president can't commit a crime, the president is above the law, those who work for him are above the law, the Constitution doesn't matter, and let's serve the few people who are our benefactors at the expense of everybody else. So there are more crimes, and there's much more that needs to be done to ensure that people don't commit those crimes again.
Absolutely. And I wasn't at all suggesting that you were in the business of rehabilitating reputations. I do think though that it was an important lesson for me, and I'm sure to many other people who read the book, to see the complexity of what was going on. It wasn't black and white, nobody, well, that's not true. Some of the people in that administration were all bad, but a lot of the people you spoke to and highlighted, they weren't. They were doing their best under terrible circumstances, maybe coming from an ideological position I have trouble with, but still trying to do their best to mitigate the worst offenses against the Constitution and the United States.
Exactly right.
So I think one of the most alarming developments is what you just spoke to, that I think it's fair to say that if any other Republican had become president in 2016, just to use a one example, they would have handled COVID the same way President Hillary Clinton or President Joe Biden would have. So another thing that Donald has done is show Republicans just how far they can go, which is to say, I think they can go as far as they are allowed to. And again, I think Donald's a symptom. You've said this many times. This is decades in the making, but he finally, I think, crossed the line and gave permission. So I think President Ted Cruz in 2016 would have been sort of a middle of the road in a lot of ways. He would have played within the system, generally speaking, the way most other Republicans would have. And now I think any Republican who got into the Oval Office in 2024 would be an autocrat because they know that they can be. Is that unfair, or do you think that's where we're headed regardless? Like, I don't think it has to be a Carrie Lake or a Ron DeSantis. It could be a Josh Hawley or a Tom Cotton or a Raphael, Ted Cruz.
I have to say, Barry, I like you. We've become friends. And when you say the words President Ted Cruz, it gives me such a
I'm so sorry.
I've, it's such a disturb. And not that President Tom Cotton or, is much better, President Josh Hawley. But you're right. Donald Trump has redefined the parameters of what is considered acceptable presidenting within the Republican Party. I think, there are people within the Republican Party that I disagree with on virtually every issue, right? Liz Cheney. I don't think I agree with Liz Cheney on any political issue.
Mm-hmm.
Would she have behaved this way? No.
Mm-mm.
And she has been super courageous to stand up and flush her career and her party down the toilet in order to say no. Would Mike Pence have behaved this way? No. Do I think he's an empty suit? He's like one of those HOV lane dummies that some,
That was such a great quote.
but he's, is he like that? Yeah, I think he's like that. But he has a modicum of respect for the law. He has a modicum of decency. And so he wouldn't have behaved that way. Some of the others you described, I don't think they have a modicum of decency. But the terms of the office have been redefined. There are all these Federalist Society characters who've been talking about the unitary executive and the idea that the president can't break the law and so forth. And
unless it's a Democrat, we need to add that caveat.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's they're partisan hypocrites, but their thinking on this, which may have once started generations ago as a seedling of legitimate political thought, has grown into a weed that's choking to death the institution it was designed to strengthen. And so we have a serious problem right now in this country, because there don't seem to be barriers to these people doing what they want to, except, of course, there are these people in the government. And on the one hand, they're career people, but they're also processes. These career people didn't just say, oh, the hell with the boss. I'm going to do whatever I want, even though I'm unelected. No, they actually said, we're a nation of laws. There's a constitution. There are federal laws that I have to follow. The president does not have the right to unilaterally abrogate those laws. And so we're gonna do what we're paid to do, and that's going to stop the flow of this. Some of them said, well, something bad has happened here, so we're going to use the whistleblower channels that exist, the inspector generals that exist. And you'll note that just as the president wants to get rid of these people, he's tried to blow up those channels. He's tried to fire whistleblowers. He's replaced inspector generals with more political toadies, because he saw those channels as barriers. And so we have a crisis in our country right now, and it's not just that Republicans are trying to eliminate free and fair elections. It's not just that they're trying to elect people with authoritarian impulses. It's they're trying to dismantle systematically every element of our system of government that protects the people, that puts the will of the people first, that puts law above individuals. And that's the end. If we don't fight this fight here, and that's why I admire what you're doing and what you've done in your books and what you're doing in this podcast. And so unless we fight this fight as though it were existential, which it is, we're going to lose it. Because look how much they've gotten away with. Look how far they've gotten. Look at what's acceptable now. And you have to realize that we are in a critical moment.
We're in a critical moment, and being hamstrung by a media that either fails to recognize the danger we're in or is okay with having things go as south as they can, because it gets them more clicks or something. I'm not really, personally, I don't think fascism is good for free press, but what do I know? But
that's a real bold. That's a real.
I know. Sorry, I'm just going out on that limb.
Yeah, it's courageous.
Thank you. But you've been on this beat much longer than I have, and recognized the problem before a lot of other people. And you've always you've been able to put it in the context of, in a historical context, as you did with your last book, Traitors, which I also recommend everybody read. But first read American Resistance, because it's I think it's an essential read for helping understand how bad, not just how bad things were. Like, a lot of people know that. Maybe a lot of people don't know the details, but I do want to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But how fragile the system is, and why that, instead of demoralizing people, that should reinforce the urgency of protecting democracy, voting, fighting, because we came very close, and I didn't think I would be saying this in 2022. Things are actually worse now than they were in 2020. Because, as you just said, we're farther down the road without any accountability, which is kind of mind blowing in some ways, and that's where political time runs fairly quickly, and justice time runs very slowly. So what they're getting away with politically completely outstrips the system's ability to rectify the situation. But it does seem like there are things that can have been done that maybe haven't been done. And one is for the Democratic Party to recognize the urgency of the problem we're facing, and two, to start strengthening the guardrails, or putting more guardrails in place. Like, for example, why is Louis DeJoy still in the post office? A small example, but sometimes it seems, and again, I sort of have made it a policy not to criticize Democrats too much, because we need them. They are the only pro-democracy party in this country, and they actually do want to make people's lives better. But shouldn't we be it feels like we're missing an opportunity by not fighting with the same energy to right wrongs, as opposed to the energy the Republicans are putting into committing wrongs.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I agree, by the way, that going after the Democratic Party now, 2 weeks before an election, where the outcome means whether we're going to be democratic or not, and small d democratic, is a mistake. I think all of us need to be one issue voters, and we need to look at a ballot and say, is this person going to preserve democracy, preserve one person, one vote, preserve our fundamental rights? Or is this person going to strip them away one at a time, whether it's the rule of law in the United States, or a woman's right to, make her own choices about her own body? And having said that, though, a much greater sense of urgency is necessary because of all the things that you've just said. And I think we have to reject out of hand the impulses, not just in people, but within institutions, to normalize what is happening, and to suggest it's politics as usual. And there are a lot of critiques that people can level at the mainstream media, and some of them are legit. We can debate how much access a journalist actually needs and what they trade for that access.
Mm-hmm.
But if neither party is seeking to destroy democracy, then withholding a little information for your book, not that I did any of that, but we know who we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
that may be okay.
Right.
That may have been okay 40 years ago.
Right.
But if one party is plotting coups, stripping away fundamental rights, aiming towards authoritarianism, and you give them any breath at all, you give them any benefit of the doubt, you normalize them in any way, you're empowering them. And that's dangerous. And there, the people who say, oh, well, we need to both sides this. We need to be balanced in our coverage, don't understand what journalism is about. Journalism is about telling the truth. And if one side is telling the truth and the other side is not telling the truth, you are not under an obligation to broadcast lies. That's not being fair That's undermining the job that you've got to protect and disseminate the truth. And so that system has broken down as well. There are far too many people, including prominent Democrats in high places, who are saying, but wait a minute, I've dealt with Republicans in the past. This has been the way I've dealt throughout my career. And that's the way, we need to treat this in the future. It's not to say we should reject all Republicans. It's not to say we shouldn't listen to the other side. It is to say it takes being honest about the potential for the onset of fascism in the United States and to call it what it is, or it's going to be here. And we're going to have opened the door to it through normalizing it. We're going to open the door to the unthinkable by helping to make it thinkable. Now, I'm going to say one optimistic thing here, okay? And I'll try to put this in an optimistic way. Media isn't what media was. And everybody's got a platform. I started doing a podcast 8 years ago. Now, back then, not everybody had a podcast. Now, lots of people have podcasts. That may sound, like small potatoes compared to big media, but it's not. Most people get their media, their information, via social media platforms or a combination of platforms. And that means everybody's got a platform. Every listener you have out there has the ability to amplify these messages, share them with other people, and make a difference. And even if they only share it with 6 other people or their family, it has a gigantic cumulative effect. Yesterday, I was on a radio show that I've always kind of revered, because I've always kind of revered NPR, because I'm that kind of an East Coast liberal, I guess. But, I've always liked, show Fresh Air, which is just an absolutely spectacularly good show. And I did a great interview about the book, and I'm incredibly grateful to them, and I admire and respect them. I then went on the Twitter when it was posted, the thing, and I said, I'm going to retweet it. And I noticed that I, who am nobody, had more Twitter followers than they did. And then I noticed, because I just looked, that you, Mary, have 5 times the Twitter followers that Fresh Air on NPR does. And so what does that mean?
Wow.
What it means is that media isn't what it used to be.
Yeah.
And voices like yours, who have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers, who every time you do something, it makes millions of impressions, can make a difference. And so, I mean, setting aside for a moment Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter,
let's do that.
Yeah, but setting that aside, all I'm saying is there is an opportunity here that never existed before, to not just say, oh, the media is letting us down, but to do something about it. Everybody has the ability to do something about it. Not everybody has the kind of platform you do or have earned, but if we mobilize all of them together, that's the power of virality, right?
That's right.
That's the power of this moment. And good politicians right now recognize that. And old school politicians are going to be swept away by it.
Yeah, it is absolutely seizing the moment or creating an organizing principle, which is what I started talking to you about months and months ago, and it fell by the wayside. But yes, I think creating a Twitter strategy, or a strategy for whatever social media that organizes a core group of like-minded people and amplifying each other's voices is incredibly important. And hey, Fresh Air, hire somebody who's savvy in social media, please, because that's
also
absurd.
Democratic. We one of our podcasts, we do half a dozen podcasts at Deep State Radio. One of them is a politics oriented podcast. by the way, it records right now as we're recording this, so I'm doing yours and not ours.
Oh,
But
thank you.
but but one of the people who is one of the co-hosts right now is a 36-year-old Democratic Party digital strategist, and her message is, time to change,
Yeah.
time to use these new approaches, time to recognize their power, because that's how we're going to win the next phase of this political fight. We're not going to win it with old tools and old techniques.
We're not, and we're also not going to win it by failing to recognize the lengths to which the other side will go. Um, I've been, we've been hearing about these armed men at drop boxes, writing down people's license plate numbers and just basically being there to be threatening and to dissuade certain people, I'm guessing, from voting. I mean, I don't think it's widespread, but wait until election day. We should probably have had something in place to counter that. But I don't know, especially given the fact that so many poll workers have had to resign or quit because of the death threats they get all the time. But it does seem to be that a lot of why we're here is kind of that failure or unwillingness, I guess, to accept the reality on the ground. And I mean, listen, it isn't pleasant to continue to have conversations about the fact that America, the United States of America, is this close to becoming an autocracy. There's no joy in that at all, but it also happens to be true, and it almost happened already. And the fact that it almost happened, and we're still not sort of shoring up our defenses to the degree that we needed to, is a little bit demoralizing. But again, there's still time. I don't want to bring people down. There's still time. I mean, there is still the vote. We are still a democracy to the extent that we ever have been. But one of the reasons I think your recent work has been so important is because in both Traitors and American Resistance, you don't just talk about how bad Donald was, right? How ill prepared and incompetent and cruel and all that other stuff. You put in the first book in a historical context, and the second book in a political context, that he was absolutely antithetical to the American experiment, and that putting people like him in power will only cause what is good about this country to disintegrate, basically. So what do you make of the fact that, given that he is and actually, everything you said has been borne out by the documents, the top secret, highly sensitive documents we now know he stole from the American government. What do you make of the fact that he is the leader, not just the leader of the Republican Party, but at least at the moment, if Republicans have their way, likely to be, I can't even believe I had to say this, the 2024 Republican nominee for president?
Well, first of all, I'd take a step back. That's a horrifying fact, right? I
Yeah.
wrote this book, Traitor, a while back to try to place what he was doing in some historical context, and drew the conclusion, based on historical analysis, that this guy was the biggest betrayer of the United States in our history.
And you didn't even know how right you were at the time.
No, because I wrote it before, January 6th and so forth. But, and Lord knows what he's doing with these top secret documents, right? But having said that, as bad as Donald Trump is, what's worse is the wave he's riding.
Yeah.
Because, imagine, I talked to you around January 6th. Here's this horrendous thing. I watched it, absolutely chilled to my bones, that I was seeing something like this happening in the United States. And for a couple of days afterwards, there were Republican statements of outrage, and then they quieted. and there was a impeachment effort, but they stopped short. And then gradually, month after month, almost 2 years now, the big lie has gained strength. Coup supporters are running for office. In the 2022 election, they're on the ballots in the majority of cases in the United States, an election denier running for office. There are people who are seeking and who will win office who have said, I would not certify Joe Biden. I would not certify that. What are they saying there? They're saying, I will not play by the rules. I will support our side over their side, and the law be damned. And they are on tickets across the country. So this movement has gained momentum. And it's a combination of forces. You know, there are the forces of ignorance, and we can set them aside for a moment, who are being swayed by the kind of Fox News driven, right-wing media driven lies. But why do those lies exist? Well, they're the forces of cynicism that are using them to get a bigger piece of the pie for themselves. They're the 1%ers who are exploiting some of the people who are doing worst in society, exploiting their fears. Why? Because if they do, they'll get support. And then what happens when the Republicans get power? Well, we've seen it. We saw what happened the last time. They had one significant piece of legislation. What did the piece of legislation do? It reduced the taxes of richest Americans to the benefit of no one else but the rich. And so that's the cynical element that's driving this forward. And then there is another element, and it's more malevolent, because it's racist, because it is trying to sell a kind of Christo-fascist view that this is a Christian country to the exclusion of everybody else. And they're trying to tap into fundamental fears and hatreds in people by saying brown people are coming to get you, black people are coming to get you, Jews are coming to get you, women are coming to get you, to get your jobs, to change your world. And so you've got the forces of cynicism, the forces of hatred, and the forces of ignorance allying themselves to create a political movement that, as we sit here right now, is predicted to prevail in 13 days, even after 4 years of Donald Trump, even after January 6th, and to have a good chance at prevailing in 2024, even though we know that if it prevails, democracy in the United States will die as we know it. And so, that is as dire as it has ever been. I can't believe it. If somebody says to me from the outside, as they often do, is this going to happen? I would have, for almost all of my life, dismissed it. And now I see it. And I say that can't be dismissed. And indeed, to consider dismissing it is to make it more likely. And so that's where we are right now. And that's why you doing what you're doing, your listeners doing what they can do, is important. And where we have to recognize and tap into the fact that there's more of us than there are of them. There are more good Americans than bad Americans. There are more Americans who want democracy than not. This is a minority movement on the other side that is desperately trying to cling to power, even though demography is against them, common sense is against them, and human decency is against them. And we've got to turn the tide back. We have to tap into those things.
Yeah, and there are more of us for sure, but that only matters if more of us vote. And I think we need to I think people need to start understanding that there are forces aligned against the Democratic Party, and in some ways against democracy. Again, not as a way to demoralize anybody, but as a way to increase the urgency of exercising your constitutional right to cast a vote for democracy. I think one of the problems we've been dealing with in the run up to the midterms is that, for months we heard that it was a foregone conclusion, of course, that Republicans are going to win because the party out of power almost always wins big in the midterm, in the first election after the presidential election. And then as the Democrats got closer, the narrative changed to, and then, but not, the Democrats got closer, it started looking good for them, but conventional wisdom prevailed. Party out of power, almost always wins. And then, as I guess the Democrats started losing a little bit of ground because fucking gas prices and inflation became more important than the bodily autonomy of half of Americans and the fact that they've been relegated to second-class citizenship and, oh yeah, democracy. It became the Democrats are in really big trouble. It's like if the Democrats are close, then isn't that bad for Republicans? No, it's always bad for no matter what it is. It's always bad for Democrats. But the other thing that you said that I want to tease out a little bit before we go is this idea that, you said it, after January 6th, everybody, with very few exceptions, was just horrified, including almost all Republicans, even those who, as we now know, were complicit in it because their lives were directly threatened. If we had been able to strike while the iron was hot, I bet a lot of Republicans would have voted to convict, like in the next couple of days. But what always seems to happen is that time just passes. Donald is able to change the narrative. Republicans get on board. And that's why we're having this conversation. Because when one side has no scruples, has no problem with lying and cheating and stealing, it is kind of difficult to know how to counter that. And it's just that history of failures of accountability we've seen since this country's inception. And yes, should Kanye West have been totally obliterated by his hideous anti-Semitism? Of course he should have. 2 weeks earlier, Donald Trump, who has vastly more influence than Kanye West, said something chillingly anti-Semitic. And he's probably grown in popularity because of that. So it's that double standard that's always that always seems to have us on our back foot.
Well, I think it's a double standard. Look, we're up against a few things here. One is, the perniciousness of their movement, the perniciousness of a media environment that they live in which perpetuating lies and hatred is now sort of an accepted norm. But it's why I come back to urgency all the time. It's why I come back to the importance of people like you with messages like yours being resumed each week, because we're not just up against people who are fundamentally evil. And we're not just up against the apathy of many Americans who say, look, this is fine, but I got to go and earn a living. I've got to go and do this. There's also entropy.
Yeah.
And entropy is, the reason that waiting 2 weeks works in these things. It was a technique, by the way, used a little bit by some of the people trying to manage Trump that I talk about in the book.
Mm-hmm.
The president of the United States would call the Secretary of Defense with an insane idea. Let's attack North Korea right now. I'm going to push the button. And the Secretary of Defense goes, Mr. President, that's an interesting idea. Why don't we talk about it over lunch tomorrow? Because they know that some of the heat's going to escape and
Mm-hmm.
he's going to be a little calmer the next day. It's why Trump, when he gets into trouble with the law, what's his main effort? Delay,
Right.
because people will forget. And if they forget, then what's going to happen? He is going to have his opportunity to wiggle out of it one way or another and get away with it because people won't mind as much over time. So we're up against entropy in a time where we need urgency, and we have to constantly bring these things back into people's attention. I really hope that people out there, go out and buy my book, because I really think, quite apart from any personal benefit that might accrue from it, that we really need to understand how the system works.
Yes.
And we need to understand the nature of the threat that we're under, that somebody wants to take away that guardrail, right? But having said that, that's not the most important thing to do. The most important thing to do right now is to vote.
Right.
And if you've already voted, then make sure the people around you vote. And if they've already voted, then get on the horn and help other people to vote. And if you have a car, drive somebody to vote. Because right now there is an issue. And the issue is elections are the only tool of accountability we have. We don't know what Merrick Garland's going to do. He's a good man, but he may move very slowly. The law may be very convoluted. We may not be able to achieve the brushback to these people that we need to. How do you do it? You do it because by voting. That's how come Donald Trump is not the president anymore. That's Joe Biden got 4.5% more votes than Donald Trump. That worked, and it can work again this time. But if it doesn't, between now and 2024, they're going to change the rules.
That's right.
You're not going to get the chance to do this again. And so, people who listen to your show or read stuff that you write and say, how come Mary's constantly trying to light a fire under our ass? Is because if we don't have a fire lit under our ass right now, we're not going to get a chance to do it again. And that's why it's so essential. And you sort of have to, it's like the Olympic torch ceremony. You have to pass the torch to everybody around you because the stakes are so high. And if you don't think you can lose it all, if you don't think we can end up being one of those countries where oligarch passes things to oligarch and the people don't have a say, you're not paying attention.
Exactly. And David, you've been doing it a lot longer than I have. I've been listening to your podcast since its inception, and read most, if not all, of your books. And whenever I talk to you, I learn so much. So I urge everybody to listen to the podcast. But for right now, pre-order American Resistance. I'll tell you why. One, you should read it anyway, because it is a profoundly important book. But two, books like yours need to be on the New York Times bestseller list. I used to have this feature on my Substack called Get the Fascists Off the List, but I stopped doing it because it was the same fucking list of fascists every week. So, we've got the list, New York Times bestseller list, Amazon bestsellers are just replete with people like Mark Levin and Bill O'Reilly and Tucker Carlson. And we need voices like yours, which again are essential and help us understand what's at stake and why it matters. So, David, thank you so much for spending all this time with me today. I so appreciate you and your work, and good luck with the big launch on Tuesday. It's this coming Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So big day ahead, and just thank you for everything you do. You're awesome.
Same, right back at you, Mary. I'm not just saying because you said a nice thing about me. What you've done is amazing, terrific. It makes a huge difference. And you also bring a voice of decency and intelligence to this debate, and a unique perspective that, has an incredible amount of value. And that's reflected by the success that you've had. But whenever I encounter anybody, I urge them to listen to what you're doing, because you're the kind of voice that's going to stop what's happening here, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. So thank you for that as well.
Well, you were very, very kind, and I feel the same way. So thank you, David, and I will hopefully see you soon.
Hopefully.
Okay. Good luck next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, thank you so much to David Rothkopf, author of the very, very soon to be released American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. I'm not kidding. It is an amazingly good book and just fascinating. We didn't get to talk enough about some of the people he interviewed, but it was Leon Panetta, Fiona Hill, Alexander Vidman, and on and on and on. We got so much insight from people who were on the ground fighting the good fight as best they could. And, one of the lessons of the book is one, that they were able to help the American people so much without our even knowing it. But two, that the extent to which they often didn't succeed because they were dealing with such a pernicious, unstoppable force. So it helped me understand a lot of what I think we all need to understand about how our institutions work and don't, and what our responsibilities are as American citizens. So thank you, David, and definitely check out Deep State Radio. I love that podcast. Okay, and thank you, of course, to all of you for being here. I so appreciate it, and I will see you next Tuesday for our very last strategy session before Election Day. Holy cow. That's Tuesday, 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific at youtube.com/politicon. And of course, next Thursday, we'll have our usual interview show at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Also at youtube.com/politicon. While you're on Politicon's YouTube page, please subscribe to Politicon. Doesn't cost anything. Like the episode, leave a comment. If you click on that button, you will be alerted anytime a new video drops. Also want to remind you that we are in the process of rescheduling our live in-person on-stage show, and we're looking to add more. So very excited about that. Hopefully I'll be back to 100% by the time that happens. And we will be doing a live election night watch party with the Nerd Avengers and all sorts of special guests. So I'm not sure yet. I think we're going to start at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday, Election Day, November 8th. Also, you can listen to this in podcast form on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a 5-star review because it really does help us introduce the show to other people. And that is it for tonight. Thank you again so much for being here. I will see you next Tuesday. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Be safe and be kind. Bye.